In today's episode, in today's podcast, I will be talking about the journey of the Cuban Americans and the Cuban Revolution of January 1959 that was led by Fidel Castro. Um, that led to the emergence as one of the most politically and economically influential Latino groups, um, even currently in the United States. Starting off with the Cuban Revolution, it really marked as a major shift in Castro's regime um, that replaced the U.S. Backed government with a socialist state. Um, it sparked fears of repression and economic instability, leading to a larger scale, like a large amount of Cubans um, coming to the U.S. And unlike other immigrant groups like the Puerto Ricans, Cuban immigration did not occur like in a steady flow, but in distinct waves. And so I will be um, talking about it, examining the like three different waves. While we explore these waves, we'll dive deeper into Miami. Miami kind of became the heart of Cuban Americans and like their community. And then we're also going to dive into the US government policies, for example, like the Cuban Adjustment Act and the Operation Pedro Pan. And these policies also supported their success along the way. In this podcast, while I examine these three waves, we're also going to look deeper into Miami and how it kind of became the heart of Cuban Americans. We're also going to dive deeper into the U.S. government policies, like the Cuban Adjustment Act and the Pedro Pan operation, um, that kind of supported their success along the way. Um, and I'll also like incorporate a few clips from documentaries, um, and give a few um, just to provide a little bit deeper insight. So I'm gonna start off with the first wave that began in 1959 after Castro's rise to power. Um, Over 500,000 Cubans fled to the U.S. between 1959 and 1979, primarily middle and upper class professionals. Many had a higher level of education and also a higher understanding or a higher, more of a grasp on the English language that gave them a significant advantage when coming into the U.S. According to a documentary, the Cuban immigration from the revolution to exile, um, these early immigrants were often light skinned and wealthier, which eased their transition into the American society. And Miami at this time became like a hub for these Cuban American, no, Cuban, it became a hub for these Cuban immigrants for several reasons. It was proximity wise, it was very close to Cuba. And so it made it just kind of like a natural destination for these Cubans to arrive. And like city, and the city's small size allowed for easier settlement without like major competition for like housing or even jobs, which was um, a big like advantage as well. And then Cubans quickly turned the area, like Calle Ocho, for example, into a cultural and economic powerhouse, transforming Miami into a hub or safe haven for these Latin Americans' business and culture to just survive and thrive. The second wave, known as the Mariel boat lift in 1980, brought 125,000 Cubans to the U.S. This group included many working class individuals and people stigmatized as undesirables um, due to the propaganda that from the Cuban government. And then the third wave occurred during the Barcelo crisis in 1994, when thousands of Cubans fled on makeshift rafts. In the short clip that I'm about to show you, the documentary I referred to earlier, Cuban Immigration from Revolution to Exile. It explains that Cuban Americans who came during the first wave were unique because they were seen as allies in the fight against communism. Um, and this settlement shaped U.S. policies, giving Cubans advantages not afforded to other immigrant groups.
Cuba is about 90 miles south of Miami. Cubans first came to the U.S. in large numbers in 1868 during a revolution in Cuba. One of the main Cuban cigar factories moved to the U.S., and many Cubans followed. Again in 1959, after Fidel Castro took power of the government, Cubans fled to the U.S. More than 350,000 Cubans left, and a third settled in Florida. Another wave of migration occurred in the 1980s. Today, Cubans represent about 4% of the total Hispanic population living in the United States.
And I'll speak a little bit more on that. But let me take a bite, because I'm getting hungry. This right here is a Berlin. It's some like Chilean dessert with powdered sugar, and it has like some like cream inside. It's super, super sweet. And the bread is like really, really sweet as well. One of the advantages or government support that really was helped these immigrants or gave these Cuban immigrants an advantage that weren't really offered to other immigrant groups. One of the most impactful policies supporting Cuban immigrants was the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966. This allowed Cubans to apply for permanent residency after just 1 year in the U.S. The act was a part of a larger Cold War strategy, and it aimed at using Cuban exiles as a symbol of freedom and a rejection of communism. The government didn't stop at residency, though. It invested heavily in refugee assistance programs, and according to an article, Cuban Exiles from the Economic Refugees to Political Activists by Sylvia Pedraza, published in the Social Problems, these programs provided housing assistance. These programs provided housing assistance, job placements, and English language training. And by 1975, over $1 billion had been spent on Cuban refugee programs, benefiting more than 300,000 people. Pedraza notes that these efforts were unprecedented and demonstrated the U.S. government's commitment to integrating Cuban refugees, a level of support not extended to other immigrant groups, which was borderline not fair, but whatever. Another bite. It's really good. Another pivotal program that supported these Cuban Americans was Operation Pedro Pan, which brought over around 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban children between 1960 to 1962, which many saw as a lifeline for children escaping repression. The program was not without controversy, though. According to the article, Pedro Pan children, forgotten victims of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis Pact by the NACLA, the Cuban government accused the U.S. of engaging in state-sponsored kidnappings. The article argues that which the programs was framed as a humanitarian effort, it was deeply tied to Cold War politics and U.S. efforts to destabilize the Castro's regime. In this other clip that I'm going to show you, for these children, leaving Cuba was both an escape and a trauma. The program offers them safety, but also forces them to leave everything they knew behind.
We thought that this would be a good opportunity for change.
But almost from the beginning, suspicions emerged about perhaps this was communism.
When the schools were all taken over by the government, that's when I began to hear that our lives were in peril.
My mother took the decision that it was a danger for me to remain in Cuba.
You're going to the United States.
It was the greatest proof of selfless love that you could ever receive from a parent.
Only when you love a person that much that you are willing to sacrifice, even not seeing them again, so they can be free.
I remember standing at the platform and looking back, and everybody's waving, and I could see my mother's face up there. And in the midst of all those people, I really think I saw her face. Or maybe I was just wishing that I had. I don't know which it is.
I looked at Cuba for as long as you could see it on the horizon, knowing somehow I knew that I would never see it again.
This aligns with the NACLA's perspective that these children were not just victims of the repression in Cuba, but also pawns in a larger geopolitical struggle. While the Cuban Adjustment Act and programs like Pedro Pan were critical to the first waves of immigrants, the Marielitos and Balseros faced a different challenge. These later groups arrived with fewer sources and encountered more skepticism from the American society. The economic downturn of the 1980s and the stigma surrounding the Maria boat-lift immigrants created barriers that didn't exist for the earlier waves. Despite American society treating these second waves of Cubans differently, the Cuban American community continued to grow and evolve no matter what. They were persistent and they kept coming, and they didn't really care what Americans were saying. And today it remains one of the most politically and economically influential Latino groups in the U.S. And while all of this happening, Miami is its cultural heart. Miami in the U.S. is now Cuba. Cuba has taken over Miami. In conclusion, the story of Cuban American is one of resilience, opportunity, and transformation. From the first wave of educated professionals to a later wave of working class immigrants, each group has contributed to the community's strength. The unique support Cubans receive from the U.S. government, combined with their own cultural values of hard work and solidarity, it created a success story unmatched by any other immigrant group. As I hope I wasn't that boring. Thank you for listening to this probably really boring podcast. I hope you don't fail me. Okay. Bye.